Okay, here we are with the first recorded lecture, Chapter 1. I'm going to break Chapter 1 into two separate videos, one a little bit longer than the other, but the end of these notes kind of is a variation in the subject matter. So for this first one, let's just get a good start on what Chapter 1 is about. And let me say from the get-go that these lectures and what's going into them goes beyond the textbook quite a bit. So I want you to understand how the class is structured here, that what I hope to avoid in most cases is simply just repeating things that are already in the book, where you should be reading about that kind of stuff and learning about all those details there. But I want to try to spend these lectures doing things that are a little different, giving a slightly different perspective, different insights, maybe taking a higher level view over some of these topics here. So good example of that here is this first chapter. So let's start, and you'll find the textbook kind of does a similar thing here. It starts by asking this question of what is it? This may seem somewhat of a mundane question, right? But it's not an easy question. That's why we want to linger over it just a little bit. And what we're also going to see here, since part of the theme of this chapter is to focus a little bit on both the history and origin of psychology as a field, as well as some of the philosophical components that are relevant. And you might think, what's philosophy got to do with it? But philosophy is actually pretty important for all sciences. If we go back, all sciences really are based in philosophy. And if we go back to the beginnings of even like the natural sciences, physics, and other physical sciences, you look at some of the earliest names that we typically think of as creating the physical sciences, physics and whatnot. Galileo, Newton, but they called themselves natural philosophers, right? What does that mean? It meant that from their perspective, what they were doing is they were taking philosophy, which classically meant our attempts at understanding the world around us and the universe around us, and even ourselves. And this is where we're going to be talking in this class about philosophy of mind, at least in this first chapter. But what people like Galileo and Newton saw themselves as doing is taking philosophy from this more abstract world of ideas into the natural world. And that's why they called it natural philosophy before we started just calling it science and physics and chemistry and biology and psychology. And so likewise with psychology, there's a lot of classic philosophy of mind, philosophical questions about the nature of what it is to have a mind, what mind is, and what kinds of things go on inside minds, and where does knowledge come from in the first place, and all that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about that. And the point here is that when we ask this question, what is psychology? Whatever answer we pick to that, I've got some choices here, that's going to have a big effect on the kind of philosophy that you're going to adopt. And likewise, it's also going to have an effect on the kind of psychological research you do. So when we look at the history of psychology as a field, a more scientific field, more or less beginning in the 1800s, we're going to see that our understanding of what psychology is has a big effect on the kind of research that's going on in the field. So let's try our first answer here, our first choice. Experience. Psychology is the science of experience. What are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about psychology being the science of things happening inside of you, right? Mental things. You are at all times having experiences. You experience being aware of something, right? You experience this class, this lecture, my voice, this image on the screen right now. That's what you're aware of, right? So you're having a perceptual experience. It's visual, it's auditory. You're also aware you're probably, I would imagine, sitting in a chair of some sort. And so you're aware of yourself sitting somewhere and having the experience of listening and watching this recording. There's kind of two levels to experience then, right? There's the kind of direct, immediate aspect of it where you're directly aware of a thing, right? Some object or event that's happening in front of you. But you're also aware of yourself having the experience, right? There's a meta kind of level going on there. Technically, that's called metacognition. That means your knowledge of your own knowledge, your knowledge of your own cognition. We have other things happening inside of us besides just awareness. We have emotional reactions to things. And we have memories and past experiences that have all been stored, right? So this is all describing. Here I've got this little note about the world as we experience it. What am I talking about here? What's the difference between saying I'm just aware of the world? I could have something in front of me. Got my phone, right? I could say I'm aware of my phone. But my awareness is describing an actual physical thing, right? The phone or whatever object. But I could also say that my knowledge is really more about my own ideas, right? The phone, as we experience it as an idea, is not exactly the same thing as the phone itself, the object itself. So what in the world am I talking about? There's a word for this. I don't know that we want to get into this deeper philosophy. I didn't put it on the slide, but the word is called qualia, Qualia, qualia. And this is a way of describing aspects of experience that don't correspond to things in the world per se. The classic example of that would be color, right? So got another thing here, just a random piece of paper laying around here. Let me get it on the screen. My background is blocking it out. There we go, that kind of works. Well, as you can kind of see, maybe the paper is yellow, right? But really, is that really the case? Is the paper yellow? Not really. Our experience of the paper has the quality or qualia of being yellow. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the paper itself has a color. And in fact, going back to, I just mentioned Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was one of the first to study light, and he refracted the sunlight through a prism to see and observe the colors of the rainbow. But he concluded, in terms of the rays of light, the quote from Newton is, "The rays have no color." And what he's talking about there is that color is not something that happens in objects or in light, which is what transmits information from objects into our eyes. The conclusion is he and some of his fellow countrymen in England, the philosopher John Locke, for example, was that color is only an aspect of experience. It is not an aspect of the object or of the light rays bringing that information about the object into our eyes. Color, the yellowness or the blueness or the redness of any particular experience, is just that. It is a way of describing experience, not of an object. One other way to kind of approach the issue here of qualia, or the uniqueness of experience, is how hard it is to actually describe the color red. So if we were to imagine speaking to someone who was completely colorblind, seeing black and white vision, which is extremely rare, but it is possible. Or if we were to, one of the usual fictions that's used to illustrate this problem is to imagine speaking with an alien who does not have a visual system, anything quite like ours, so therefore does not respond to light and in any sensory way, and has never experienced colors whatsoever. Yet somehow we're going to be able to communicate with this thing. And again, we're trying to describe what it is for something to be red. And we have really no words, right? To make someone, the point here is to somehow with our words make someone actually see redness in their mind just through our descriptions of it. We can make associations. We can say red is hot and blue is cool or cold. But that's again just an analogy, right? It doesn't actually make someone understand what red is as an experience. It's kind of like this thing where you can only understand it once you see it, right? Another example is sound. Thinking of sound as being maybe music as being high pitched or low pitched, right? So high pitched tones and low pitched tones are different from each other, but that aspect is a way of describing our experience. It doesn't describe the sound itself, which is described as a wave. And waves have mathematical properties. They can have an amplitude and they can have a wavelength or a frequency, which is a little more appropriate for describing sound waves. And we know that high frequency tones create high pitched experiences and low frequency tones create low pitched experiences. So it seems there's really some sort of really, important relationship there between the frequency of a sound wave and the perceptual experience of it in terms of the perceived pitch. But it's important to again, though, emphasize that pitch as a psychological experience isn't exactly the same thing as the actual wavelength of a waveform, right? The physical distance between the peaks and the two consecutive waves. So that's the kind of part of the fundamental difference there. And another component too is, of course, that when it comes to sounds, we hear a little more complexity than just tones that have high and low pitch, right? But we hear in music, we hear melodies, right? And melodies are complex patterns. And again, it's hard to say that the melody as this higher ordered psychological thing is easily explainable in terms of the frequencies and the intense amplitudes of various waves, right? So trying to understand experience, as you might imagine, is actually pretty difficult because it doesn't seem to be the case that when it comes to understanding experience, that we can understand it by studying things, right? If I want to understand what it means for someone to experience yellow and blue and green and red and so on and so forth, studying objects and studying pigments and paints may not really get me the entire picture. I have to do something a little bit more weird, is the right word, I think, to understand experience. What's going on inside the minds of other people or myself to help us understand what experience is all about. That's going to be one of our major issues here. Second choice, interactions. So here we're pulling the science outside of the mind a little bit here, where the first choice was basically like what's going on inside minds, all locked away inside your mind, these private personal experiences. But within an interactive approach, we can say that, well, that's important. The internal side of things is important, but we also have to realize that ultimately the goal of having any kind of psychological experience is about helping us interact with the world around us. We can do things, right? We can stand on a floor or a ground plane. We can walk around without hopefully tripping over things, so we can kind of see where we're going, right? And we can pick things up and use them for various activities, use tools and so forth. And we interact with other people, other living things, and we have complex interactions with other people in the form of language and various other, facial postures and displays that maybe convey emotions, right? Convey what's happening inside of our minds. That's part of the whole aspect of communication and language, is how do I take all of my experiences and find a way to convey them to another person so that they can also understand what I'm experiencing. That's what language is all about. I have ideas and experiences in my mind, and I want someone else to understand that, maybe to share in the experience, have that experience too. And I have to find a way to find the right words or the right gestures or the right facial expressions to make another person do that. In fact, the entire thing that I'm doing right now to try and teach psychology to you is for me to take all of what's going on in my mind about everything that I know about psychology and find a way to get that into your mind too, right? And that's, again, the sharing of an experience, and that's an interactive process, right? So now we're dealing with the difference between me doing something and some other thing that I'm interacting with, whether it's picking up an object. I picked up my phone earlier, so I could do the same thing. I pick up me picking up the phone. That's me as the subject, because I am subjectively experiencing the entire interaction. I'm subjectively experiencing the fact that I want to pick the object up, and maybe some reason as to why I want to pick it up, right? And then, of course, I'm aware of my hand reaching out to pick up the object and coming into contact with it and bringing it up to my face, right? So that's the subjective side of things, right? Me subjectively experiencing and being involved in this interaction. The objective side is the thing that is interacted towards. This is, again, where language becomes important, because oftentimes when you hear about subjects and objects, you're thinking about literary stuff, right? You're talking about basic grammar, about how to diagram a sentence. And we know that, for example, in typical language, at least in English, you have what's called a SVO, or subject verb object construction of a sentence. That's the very basic way of constructing a sentence. There's a subject and an object, and the verb is whatever the subject does to the object, right? I kick the ball. I am the subject. The ball is the object, and the kick is what the subject is doing to the object, right? And so the study of more of an interactive psychology is a little bit less abstract, because now it lets us take things out of the mind and talk about what people do in the world, how they interact with the world. Notice I have a little asterisk here, because that connects up to the nature of the world as we experience, because that subjective side of things is still here, right? And we need to kind of figure out what the difference is between the subject and the object when it comes to doing this kind of psychology. And I have a little bit of an example as we go into these notes here. Third choice, processes. So this sounds a little bit like the first one, maybe. We're talking about things happening inside of people, experiences and so forth. But the difference here is that we're not talking about these weird, abstract, subjective kinds of things like, why is it that you experience red as red the way you do? But here we're talking about things that are a little bit concrete, more measurable, a little bit more scientific, perhaps. We know, for example, that we can bring in information from the outside world, right? We have those light rays coming in, and that activates receptors in our eyes and then sends signals on back to other parts of the brain. And likewise, the sound waves are coming into your ears, and that sends information on back to other parts of your brain. And somewhere in there, all that stuff gets integrated so that you have a whole perceptual experience of the world, right? But there's a way of explaining these processes, right? We know something in a scientific way about how the receptors in our sensory organs work, how that gets transmitted into the brain, and what some of the different sections in the brain are actually doing with that information. So that's a process, and we can describe that. And then once the information is in us, right, it's perceived and we're aware of it, we can do things with that information, right? We can store it in various kinds of memory systems, right? And now we have these memories of past experiences, and we use that. Whether it's current or old information, we can use it to engage in reasoning processes, to make decisions about it, to engage in problem-solving activities. Whatever it is we do, it's driven by all of these ideas that are in our minds, and all this information that we can process. And of course, we use it to control our actions. Well, let's have a look at some history here. So there's a few psychological, you might say, schools of thought that involve experiential approaches. That is, say they take experience as to be the fundamental thing that they're really interested in studying, because as far as they're concerned, psychology is the scientific study of experience, right? So our first one goes back to the late 1800s. This is a school of thought. It's called phenomenology. And this term actually has its roots in some old philosophy. A guy named Immanuel Kant talked about the difference between the phenomenal world, which is the world of the mind, and the noumenal world, which is a world about outside things. And so these philosophers slash psychologists of the late 1800s, Brentano and Husserl primarily are big names in this field. They took that philosophy and they basically said, you know, that's our goal, right? So the outside world, this world out there, objects and things like that, that's for people like Isaac Newton to try to figure out, the physicists, the chemists, right? Their job is to understand those kinds of things, right? So physics, your job is to study physical objects. But what about the mind? And their argument is, well, the methods of the physical sciences are not going to work to help us understand mind or experience or consciousness. So therefore, we have to come up with new methods. We need to invent a new science. And they called it phenomenology, because the word phenomenon itself refers to that kind of more abstract nature of mental experience. So that's what they want to understand here, is they want to understand experience. But there's another important word there. They want to understand meaningful experiences. And this is where some things come back to what I talked about with qualia, right? So what does it mean for an experience to be meaningful? And if you think about that question, it's a little bit of an odd one. What does it mean for an experience to be meaningful? What does it mean for anything to be meaningful? What's the meaning of the word meaningful? What's the meaning of the word meaning? I don't know that I have a really good answer for that, but what I want to emphasize here is that that's part of what the phenomenologists were really trying to do, is they are making an argument here about something important about meaning. What they're saying is that meaning is a property only of minds. What makes a mind different from, say, an object? Again, let me come back to my phone. The phone itself does not have actual meaning. It doesn't have psychological meaning. It's just a thing, right? But now we all have an idea about the phone. Or let me pick something a little more familiar to you as opposed to my phone. Let's think of an object like your house or your apartment. That thing as a thing, it's just, you know, it's just an object, right? It doesn't have meaning. Now, it may have meaning to you, but the point, of course, is that when I say to you, I'm talking about now your experience and your idea. So let's think about the difference between your idea about your house versus the actual house itself, right? There's a difference there. What we have inside of us, we call a mental representation, right? So you have your idea. You can close your eyes and you can have a mental representation of anything at all. You can have a mental representation of a hippopotamus, because now that I've said that, you could visualize a hippopotamus. And that is your mental representation. It's not necessarily attached to a very specific real hippopotamus anywhere in the world, right? But likewise, of course, there is somewhere out there a real hippopotamus, and it's not necessarily attached to any idea that you have, right? So there's this kind of distinction between, again, subjects and objects. People with their meaningful ideas and objects out there in the world. That's not to say that hippos don't necessarily have experiences. So let me pick an inanimate objects like again, I mentioned house earlier, or something a little bit easier, a hammer, right? It's just a thing. It doesn't have experience. It doesn't have meaning by itself. It only has meaning with our understanding of it. So how do we try to study this stuff? Well, what Husserl basically claimed is that the only way to study meaningfulness is to study it directly by observing it. And how? How can you do that? Well, his argument is that we use introspection, or a phrase that they used back then of internal perception. Because if we think about it, if I want to study a rock, I need to observe it, right? And that's the scientific method, is to observe things. But if I want to try to apply the scientific method to the study of psychology, and my definition of psychology is it's the science of experience, I need to find a way of observing experience. And I can't really observe that in other people, so I have to observe it in myself, right? So I have to try to understand the meaningfulness of an experience by understanding my own experiences. So phenomenology is an early school of thought in psychology that basically involved people sitting around introspecting, right? In some cases, it was the person themselves, of course, but a lot of what they were doing was actually kind of training research subjects to introspect and provide some reports about their reactions to various images, perhaps. As you can imagine, this kind of stuff being very subjective didn't really make a lot of progress scientifically. So it's one of the early schools of thought, but no longer an active school of thought. Now, it did have an influence, though, because in the early 20th century, there was an outgrowth of phenomenology into a new field of psychology called Gestalt psychology. You might have heard of this before if you've had any exposure to psychology, especially to, say maybe you're just high school psychology or whatever, but Gestalt psychology is a psychology that's really mostly interested in perception, how we visually perceive the world, for example. And we have a whole chapter on that. So we'll talk a little more about these guys in chapter 5 when we talk about sensation and perception. But they had some ideas, and maybe even some research techniques that were not purely introspective, that helped us understand how it comes to be that perceptual experience has some kind of meaning associated with it. They talked about these innate tendencies for our brains to see certain kinds of patterns, for example. And if you've ever heard of, people talking about how, for example, you'll see some kind of abstract pattern, you look at weird swirly pictures on tiles and you see faces or whatever. The Gestaltists argue that that's just the innate tendency of our brains to prefer and to look for certain kinds of patterns in the otherwise ambiguous sensory input that comes in to our eyes and all of our sensory organs. If we fast forward a couple more decades into the middle of the 20th century, we get another kind of psychology that doesn't necessarily have an obvious connection to the other two. Humanistic psychology is the study of, as the term implies, what it means to be a human being. But of course, this becomes an existential kind of question, right? What's the meaning of life? What does it mean to exist, to be a human, to be a person? But it's connected to phenomenology because their answer to this is that what it means to be a human, what it is to have an experience, right? That's what makes us who we are, is that we all have our own experiences and our own lives. So if you've ever heard the cliche about psychology, when this idea that someone would go to a therapist and talk about their problems, and the therapist doesn't actually say much to them except kind of turns back to them and says, well, how does that make you feel? And it's become a bit of a joke, even a disparaging way of describing this kind of psychology, right? Because you think it's not really doing anything to help the person. It's just something to say almost, right? But this was actually invented by Carl Rogers with his approach called client-centered therapy. And there's actually a pretty well-reasoned argument for why doing that is an important technique. And as far as Carl Rogers is concerned, the whole nature of a person's life and the problems, whatever psychological problems they might be having, that's something that's happening in their life. And it's their own subjective, again, to use that term, it's their own subjective experiences that are all involved in whatever psychological problems they're having. So it would be completely inappropriate for Rogers himself, now thinking about himself sitting as in the chair as the therapist, to impose his own views on how that person should deal with their problems. His argument is that no one can actually tell you how to deal with your problems. No one can actually tell you how to live your life. It's your life that you have to live, not anyone else's. So the problem, though, is that when, at least from Rogers's perspective, is that a lot of people don't really understand the meaning of their experiences, right? Something happens to them and it bothers them and it makes them upset and they're trying to find a way to deal with it. But they don't understand how to deal with it because they're not doing a good job of connecting it to the rest of their life, to understanding how it relates to other things happening in their lives and how do they really actually feel about this experience. Maybe they're not, they're not necessarily introspecting about it. They're not really good. Maybe that's the case, that some people are just not good at thinking about their lives and their experiences. They're not in the habit of introspecting. And so for Rogers, he's basically saying, you know what you need to try to do is you need to introspect. You need to think about this. You need to understand what it means to you. And I can't tell you what it means to you, but maybe I can help you learn how to think about that, how to introspect. And so by asking these kinds of questions, making someone think about how do I feel is a way of kind of prodding them into an introspective state of mind so that they can then have the insight that they need to fix themselves. That's what humanistic psychology. So it's a focus again on the nature of personal, meaningful, subjective experiences. So that fits it into this category here. So all throughout this, I've been just talking about the nature of a subjective experience and how the subject-object distinction of the interactive approaches is kind of a little funky philosophically with all of that subjective side of stuff. So let's think a little bit more about mind and meaningfulness. Brentano on the previous slide described meaningfulness as another word for it. He called it intentionality. What does that word mean? We use that word a lot, right? If somebody does something, you might ask yourself or ask them, did you do that intentionally? And what we mean by that is, did you do that on purpose? And there's a presumption there behind that question, which is that there could have been purpose behind the action, as opposed to some actions perhaps having no purpose. And so we talk about the difference between intentional versus unintentional, which we sometimes think of as being on accident. Like, no, I didn't do that on purpose. I tripped and fell. That was not on purpose. It was unintentional. And so we have to think about, what does it mean to have purpose? And that's kind of like the question before of what does it mean to have meaning? The answer is kind of the same. To have purpose means to have a mind, right? That before I do something, before I reach out and pick up my phone, as I have done a few times already. Where's it at? There it is. It's getting darker outside, so my picture, as I bring the phone up to the camera here, it's getting a little bit darker, and so my virtual background is failing me a little bit here. Sorry about that. Anyway, to have purpose means to have a mind, right? Because before, if I reached out and picked up an object and I said I did that on purpose, I did it intentionally, it means that before I engaged in the action, I had the plan, I had the idea. I said to myself, I want to pick up the phone. So that's what the intentionality means, or purpose means, is that there was a thought process behind the action that guided the action and controlled the action. And without that thought process, without that intention, without that purpose, there would have been no action, right? And again, it relates to the whole issue of meaningfulness, because one of the things that we have to talk about here is the issue of directedness. This is another way of talking about meaning. I could say that my thought or my idea about an object such as the phone has meaning because it stands for something beyond itself, right? The phone itself, I mentioned before, is just an object, it's just a thing, it has no meaning. And one of the reasons for that is because it doesn't stand for anything. It doesn't refer to something outside of itself. It just is, it's just a thing. But your idea of the phone does stand for something, right? It's a representation. It represents, it stands for, it symbolizes, it refers to something beyond itself. And we call this property directedness. The object is not directed towards anything. The phone it's just itself, right? But your thought is directed towards something. Your intentional behaviors are directed towards things. If I say I want to pick up the phone, that is now my desire of wanting to do something that's directed towards some object in the world. So that's where the directedness comes in. This has had an effect in psychology. This has been a kind of psychology and a kind of philosophy as well. So in philosophy, the idea of intentionality sometimes can be traced back to an important guy, Descartes. We talk about Cartesian approaches to the mind, Cartesian ways of talking about the mind. And one of the key things here is called dualism, mind-body dualism, because it's focused on what we think of as the so-called mind-body problem. Just go into it briefly. There's a little bit more in the book. And so, like I said, I don't want to repeat a lot of stuff in the book. But when I said before that I had the idea that I want to reach out and pick up the phone, we might suggest that what's happening here is that this idea is something that happens in my mind. But according to Cartesian mind-body dualism, mind is not the same thing as the body or the brain being a part of the body, of course. Mind and body are somehow different. The mind is a little bit more ephemeral, more abstract, more ghostly in nature. In fact, of course, what I didn't mention is that the word psychology, psyche, invented by Plato actually, was a word Plato invented to describe the soul. And that's exactly what Descartes was talking about when he's defining mind as well. He's using the word psyche, deriving directly from Plato. And the nature of mind is equated with this more spiritual kind of thing. But the body is physical, right? It's made of matter. It's made of atoms. But the spiritual mind is not. So dualism means that there's two kinds of things in the world, right? Dual meaning two. There are mental, spiritual things, and then there are physical body things. And we're faced with a particular hard problem at this point because we have to think, how is it that when I have the idea in my mind that I want to do something like pick up an object, that this mental idea somehow has an effect on the physical body to make my arm move. And then once my arm has moved and come into contact with the object, that provides input back to the mind. And so somehow the mind can have awareness of what the body is doing. How could there be any back and forth between these two very different kinds of things, mental things and physical things, especially when they're defined in ways, as Descartes did, that makes them almost complete opposites of each other? I don't have an easy answer for that either, except that a lot of times in philosophy, we try to avoid dualism at all costs. If you see any kind of evidence that this particular theory about the mind is hinting at a dualistic disconnect between mental and physical, then we try to avoid that. We try to say, oh, that's a bad idea, don't do that. In psychology, we get another school of thought here. It's called voluntarism. Now, I want to caution you that you might see in your textbook that this guy, Wilhelm Wundt, is associated with a school of thought called structuralism. And that's a small error that it's perpetuated in a lot of textbooks. And I guess I don't need to worry you about why structuralism and voluntarism are confused in introductory psychology textbooks. But just keep in mind, the book's wrong. All the books are wrong. But don't worry about it. And if you see structuralism in the textbook there, just think of voluntarism and everything will be fine. But it's called voluntarism for a reason, because Wundt is interested in the subjective side of our interactions with the world and what's actually going on to cause us to be able to engage in intentional behaviors. And that's, of course, when we talk about things being intentional, we think about things being voluntary, right? Hence why he's calling his approach voluntarism. And what's particularly important in terms of voluntary or intentional behavior is something that we call the will, right? So if I say that I want to do something, it's because I am willing myself to do that, right? This will happen. It is me making it happen, right? And sometimes, this is another philosophical issue, we talk about and we use words like free will, right? And what that's getting at is the issue is my will, is my inner sense of agency, is that something that's free to do as it wills, or is it actually constrained by prior causes? And the opposite of free will is called determinism. Determinism implying that every action of the will is determined by some prior cause, and therefore our behaviors cannot violate or deviate from this chain of cause and effect. Part of Wundt's ideas too focused on our ability to perceive the world. His argument is that we have to use our will to explore our environments and to perceive, and then also to apperceive. And that's a word that we don't use in psychology anymore, though of course it was part of an important part of the beginnings of psychology. The reason is that we've actually broken it up into two different parts or processes and given them new names. Sometimes apperception is equivalent to the modern idea of attention, right? There's a difference between perception being just this process of bringing in information from all of our five senses, but attention is that when we restrict our focus onto just some aspect of all of that information, right? And that's one thing that apperception means. But we also have what we also now call short-term memory or working memory, which is the contents of your mind as you're thinking about information and what's going on in your mind right now. And that could also be described as apperception because, of course, that's occupying the focus of your attention and your mental effort. But anyway, these are the kinds of things that Wundt was trying to study. Now, he also used introspection, so of course that makes him fit within the experiential side of things, but he also used some other kinds of methods, right? He used reaction time studies. In fact, that's one of the earliest methodologies in all of psychology, is to present a stimulus to someone and to have them respond as quickly as they can and measure the time it takes for them to respond. That's called reaction time. And what we discover from that is a few things, perhaps. One, of course, is that even in the simplest possible case of stimulus followed by response, see the light, press the button, the response is not instantaneous. It takes some kind of time delay. And we understand that that probably involves some stages of processing. Some of it might just be neural transmission of information. The nerve signal has to go in from your eyes and has to travel through the visual parts of the brain, and then it has to travel into the motor parts of the brain, and that has to travel down into your spine to then control the motor nerves that control the muscles of your hand and fingers to press whatever button. That's quite a lot of neural processing, so there might be a time delay for that. But also we discovered that as Wundt did, that if you make the task a little bit more complicated, you add more stimuli or more responses that people have to do, the reaction time just goes up and up and up. And so the argument here is that these increases in the time it takes to respond and process the information tells us something about what's happening in the stages of processing. But as we have kind of gotten into here, we do have to worry about the problem of introspection, right? We mentioned it before that there seems to be this kind of subjective aspect thing of going on when it comes to trying to use introspection to study our own experiences. I said before that that was not very scientific, but I didn't really explain why. So one of the issues here is that while it is possible that I can describe my own experience of something being red or blue or green, or my own experiences of various emotions, or whatever it happens to be, or a particular melody, I cannot necessarily establish for sure that other people have the same experiences that I do. Sometimes that's really obvious, right? That I might enjoy a particular melody and you may not, right? So there's that whole issue of taste, right? There's other things a little bit more abstract, such as when I look at something like a flower, which happens to be red, let's say. How do I know that the nature of that experience of redness inside my mind has anything at all to do with the kind of red that you experience it? The way you experience red might, in fact, be very different. And we would never really be able to understand that because we both use the same word, we both use the same red to describe our own personal experiences. And that one word obscures the possibility that our own internal experiences might in fact be very different from each other. And we would never be able to know that because all that I know is that you're saying, that looks red to me. I don't know what that experience is actually like for you. So the issue here is that I can introspect and talk about my own experiences, but that doesn't tell me anything about other people's experiences. And then we might even go a little bit farther and to say, how do I know that other people have experiences at all? That seems to be somewhat obvious, you might think, that if I have subjective experiences, I'm aware of things and I have feelings, surely other people do too. And even if we don't always agree about what sounds good and what looks good and so forth, we still understand that, yeah, we both have things that we like and dislike, and that's all, we all have experiences. But how do I really know that? And we can go a little bit farther, of course, and think, well, this, one way in which we might try to establish that with humans is through language, because other people talk to us and they tell us what they're feeling. So that must convince us that they have these feelings. But animals, on the other hand, cannot necessarily do that. Maybe they can communicate to some extent about their feelings. If an animal is in pain, it might exhibit particular behaviors, sounds that it makes. And so we say, oh, the animal has communicated to me its feelings. It's telling me that it's hurting. But again, we still have to ask this question, how do we really know that the animal experiences pain? It's one thing that the animal might have an injury, or another person might have an injury. And we can describe at a physical level the nature of that injury, and we can even perhaps describe some aspect of the neural processing involved in reacting to that might actually lead to particular kinds of behavioral responses like crying. But it's another thing entirely when we get back to that whole mind-body dualism to talk about the feeling of pain. Again, so the feeling of pain is not the same as the injury or the neural processing. That's the psychological distinction from the physical process. So, as another example too, by the way, a popular methodology in modern neuroscience is called functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, right? We have people in an MRI tube scanning their brains and we have them engage in various tasks and we see different parts of their brain light up and we think, oh, that part of the brain is involved in that process, but we might be tempted to say, I can see their thoughts, right? That activation in some part of the brain, that's their thinking. But no, it's not. It's just neurons in the brain. And we're going to be talking about neurons in chapter 3. So you'll understand how the brain works and how the cells of the nervous system work, but it's just processes and activity, physiological things happening in the brain. So we're faced with another philosophical problem here called the problem of other minds. The question here is, can we really observe other minds? And that's an important question because when it comes to doing science, science is about observing things. And if you can observe it, then you can talk about it being a scientific study. But what's important about observation is that it's objective, and we need to make sure we can have a good definition of what it means to have an objective observation, and that means having more than one person observe and agree. So if I can look at a a rock and describe it, and another person can look at a rock and describe it, and we can agree on our observations, then we can say we've got geology as a science, right? And we can say that's a science now because we can have objective observations. You, me, and 10 other people can all look at the same rocks, and we can compare our observations, and we can say we've got some geological knowledge here. But what about minds? Can I, again, I can look at my own personal experiences, but you can't. And you can look at your own personal experiences, but I can't look at yours. So can we have any actual objectivity there? And so this is what's called in philosophy the problem of other minds, which really boils down to how do I even know that other people have minds to begin with? Well, all that I really know is that they behave in certain ways. And those behaviors might be similar to my behaviors. And I assume that, well, my behaviors are governed by my own mind. So therefore, I'm assuming that other people's behaviors must be governed by their minds. But without my ability to observe their minds, I cannot claim that minds exist as a scientific fact. And that is really the essence of the problem here. We could say that rocks exist as a scientific fact because me, you, and 10 other people can observe the rocks, but I cannot say that mind exists with the same kind of scientific justification. And so that certainly would be a big problem, right? So that's called the problem of other minds, because how do we study minds scientifically if they cannot be observed in any objective way? So we might suggest, for example, perhaps, is that, well, mind isn't really what we're trying to study. Maybe it's behavior. We can observe behaviors, right? We can observe the actions of other people, behaviors of other people and of other animals, and we can study that kind of stuff. Let's think about an example here. When it comes to trying to study the problem of other minds and what's going on inside the minds of other people, sometimes we're interested in the minds of computers. Are we? Well, certainly some people might be, because we have tried for some time to invent intelligent machines. And by an intelligent machine, I mean a machine that can solve problems. And in some ways, we have done so, right? Because computers can solve all kinds of problems for us, from simple calculators that can simply just solve mathematical arithmetic problems for us. But we have more complex machines, especially in 2020, compared to when digital calculators were invented, or an abacus from hundreds of or even a couple thousand years ago. We have machine learning algorithms, right? We have computers that can look at photographs and recognize what's there. And we might look at this ability of computers to engage in that kind of pattern recognition, to learn from experience and change its behaviors over time, and suggest that that's a form of intelligence. And then we might ask the question, does that mean that the computer has intelligence? And then we ask the question, is that what we mean by artificial intelligence? And a lot of times we think, oh, that's just this future thing where we've got the, you know, some machine that goes crazy and tries to take over the world. But we may already have some form of artificial intelligence, given the ability of computers to do the kinds of things they can do now. Though we might end up thinking, well, they still haven't quite matched the level of human functioning, human intelligence, but it's something, right? But we have to ask this question, when I say, is the machine intelligent? What I might be implying there is the machine intentional? That is, does it have purpose? Does it have awareness? Is it aware of its own purposes and plans? We are, and that's a very crucial thing, right? When I say that behavior is intentional, I say that not only do I have a purpose to my actions, but I'm aware of that purpose. I know why. Computers might have purposes because they've been programmed to have a purpose, but are they aware of their purpose? Do they know why they exist? And that is something that remains to be an unanswerable question, right? Because it's the problem of other minds. Just like I cannot see the mind of another person, I cannot see whether the computer has such awareness. So when it comes to trying to determine if a machine is truly intelligent, one of the first examples was called the Turing test, kind of proposed by this guy, Alan Turing, who is one of the main inventors of computers, one of the fathers of computer science. And what Alan Turing imagined is something akin to like a modern instant messaging kind of chat. Imagine that you were simultaneously chatting with two entities, and you're interviewing both of them. And your goal is to determine, you've been told in advance, one of these entities is a real person and the other is a machine. And you just have to ask questions and figure out which one's the person and which one's the machine. And what you might find is that when you ask your question, the person gives you a pretty normal sounding answer. But when you ask the machine a question, the answer you get back doesn't seem right. It seems like it's canned in some way, right? Like the machine just has programmed within it a few pre-programmed answers, and that's all it's capable of giving you is these standard generic answers. It doesn't seem like it's quite really the right answer. At which point it's easy for you to distinguish the person from the machine, and you're going to get it right. And we would say the machine has now failed the test, failed the Turing test. But what if it was possible that the machine was smarter than that? And the machine was capable of doing something like analyzing human language and being able to then figure out an appropriate response to a given query. And it gave you a response that seemed actually somewhat pretty natural. How would that work? How could that happen? What if this machine was enabled to maybe access social media and was able to download the content of tweets and Facebook posts and instant messaging stuff and all these public chats, and it was able to extract all these patterns of human language, and then it was able to imitate that? You could potentially end up attempting to have a conversation, maybe even actually having a conversation with this machine. At which point you might go for several minutes and be left to conclude that that was not a machine, but maybe that was a real person. You're tricked, you're fooled. And this is when we say the machine passes the Turing test. So we still have to ask the question here, does that mean it's truly intelligent? Does that mean that it's truly aware of the meaning of the conversation that it had with you? And of course, the answer remains, we have no idea. What we know is that the machine fooled you, right? The machine was capable of making you think that it was having thoughts. But that doesn't tell us that the machine really had thoughts. So the Turing test is really only a definition of artificial intelligence that focuses on behavior. It focuses on how convincing, how complex is this machine's responses and participation in the conversation. So maybe we can study behavior, but maybe we can't study other minds. That's not very scientific, perhaps. I think what we want to do is I think we want to pause at this point, because I think that's a lot of information. So what we're going to do is we're going to stop at this point while we're philosophical. And before we switch to a different kind of psychology that takes us away from all of this more subjective, mentalistic, intentionality kind of weirdness, let's stop it there and then pick up on the second part of the video, and we'll go into the next kind of thing in psychology.